Welcome to the Safe Space Podcast. I'm your host, Sydney Rosant. Obviously, this episode is not going to be just me talking into the camera. I do have a very, very special guest for you guys. His name is Korey Wilson, and he's running for the state senate in Alabama, District number 7. You're going to learn all about his upbringing, all about his purpose, all about his political aspirations, and what he wants for the state of Alabama. What I need to tell you all is that the midterm elections are not just right around the corner anymore. They are here. If you can vote early, please make a plan to do so. One of the reasons why I wanted to speak to Korey was because oftentimes we pay a lot of attention to the president, to our senators, to our congressmen and women. And we forget that it's the people who are running for office locally that have a huge impact on the quality of our lives as well. So if you're the type of person that only goes to the polls every 4 years, you're doing yourself and your community a disservice. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Safe Space Podcast. I'm your host, Sydney Rosant, and I have a very exciting guest. I'll let him introduce himself, though.
What's up, everybody? My name is Korey Wilson. I'm the Democratic nominee for Alabama State Senate District number 7, and it's a pleasure to be on the podcast, Sydney. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course, anytime. So also, I think everyone should know that the general election is on November 8th.
November 8th, we're
Yes.
like 2 weeks out. If you're unsure if you have registered to vote or if you're unsure about your registration, please visit your state Secretary of State's website, or you can Google like your state board of registrars, depending on how it's set up. And it is very easy these days to check your registration and to make sure that you're registered to vote.
hmm Definitely. So, I kind of want to get a little bit more of your story, more than what we can find on like Ballotpedia. So like, where are you from, and like, how did you get involved in politics in the first place?
I have always been interested in politics because even at like a young age, I'm talking like 7 or 8 years old, I understood that so much of our day-to-day lives were fueled by the decisions of people that we empower with our vote. In the last 10 years or so, I graduated college and went to the University of Montevallo. I studied theater. I was on SGA there, as well as like a few sort of like intramural clubs and activities where I often held leadership roles. And then well, really before I graduated. So this is like the real sort of like political awakening for me. When the events around Trayvon Martin's killing unfolded, um, I immediately thought to myself, like, this is a grave injustice. I believe it was February 26, 2012 that it happened. I believe that that's the correct date. I know it's February 26th. I'll never forget that date, in part because it is my mom's birthday. So when the events around that sort of unfolded and we started getting the news and the police recording all these things, I was illusioned, thinking that, okay, my parents integrated schools, my grandparents had to fight, for their right to vote. America has made all this progress. Barack Obama's in office now. Like, this will be sort of like an open and shut case that Trayvon Martin's human and civil rights were taken from him, and that, the American criminal justice system will see that and we'll get justice, right? Or at least accountability. And so that following year, it was April 2013. I remember the verdict came out over a Saturday night because I had church the next Sunday or the next day. Um, and I was following that case for so long and so closely. Um, that morning, I woke up, I checked the news, and I saw that a not guilty verdict had been handed down, and I was crushed. I was deflated. Um, and so after that happened, we started to get more media scrutiny of policing and police brutality, particularly as it pertains to Black people, especially Black men. And so after that April, I was like, okay, I got to get more involved.
Mm-hmm.
And so you start going to protests, you start meeting um, organizers who are willing to sort of take you under their wing and tell you sort of like how we affect change if we're not already in political office. And so after that, I just wanted to make sure that marginalized folks, wherever I was, um, were organized, that they were registered to vote, that they were going to the polls, that if there were issues sort of affecting them, that they knew that there were avenues to changing things. Because I think that really in that time, really from my perspective, from like the Bush administration onto sort of like the end of the Obama administration, well, really from the Bush administration probably until 2012, um, there wasn't a whole lot of, I guess, grassroots organization in the way that we're seeing today. And so I just kept connecting with people. I was in New York from 2015 to 2019. Um, I don't know if you remember, but in 2014, that summer, um, there was a lot of media coverage. You had Mike Brown, Eric
Mm-hmm.
Garner, John Crawford III, like all these high profile uh, lynchings, in my
Mm-hmm.
opinion, that happened consecutively. And I was also working on my undergraduate research project at that time. Um, and so when I was doing my undergraduate research project, I started reading these different books. My project was on stand up comedy, and sort of the relation between stand-up comedy, joke theory, and politics. Because in order for a joke to be understood and elicit a reaction, you have to have like prior knowledge of the content before.
Mm-hmm.
And so at that time we still had specials coming out by, and I mean they're still today, but like Hannibal Buress, Dave Chappelle, Trevor Noah. I focused mostly on Black men, basically on from Richard Pryor and Bill Cosby down to like today, and to see this through line of people talking about issues that are negatively impacting Black communities, and the fact that this content, their content, gives them a broad audience and broad platform, that if we're still sort of like laughing at these things today, then how can there be so much news coverage at that time,
Mm-hmm.
8 years ago, saying that, oh, we elected the first Black president, we are moving into, or we have moved into a post-racial society. So all that happens. I come back to Alabama. I become a volunteer for the Elizabeth Warren campaign. Then in 2020, I worked for the Alabama State Democratic Party as an organizer. And then in 2022, I was asked to run. I had not intended to run. I thought I would go and be an organizer again, but I answered that call. And it has been an experience, an eye opening experience, a very rewarding experience, because realizing that so much of my community organizing background um, has allowed me to reach out and connect with voters and really hear their issues and things like that. We have a real opportunity to make some changes in my home state of Alabama. So that's the story. I'm sorry it's so long. I hope your listeners don't tune out. But that's the through line of like the last decade of my life.
Mhm. Well, I'm so grateful for you telling your story. I think it's important to hear, what your motivations are. I think a lot of times politicians get such a bad rap for like not being honest or just wanting to take people's money or being corrupt. And so I think it's important for people to understand that like it's not just the president and it's not just, the Senate that exists, that there's people, local people who are running for office who just like you said, they just answered a call and felt like, I want to do things to help my community. But now that you've answered the call, do you have any higher political aspirations?
Not at present. Not at present. If a need arises, I'm a role player,
Hmm.
honestly. Like I am, like late stage Carmelo Anthony or anybody, who sort of like is supposed to be the shooting guard or the power forward. Like
Hmm.
if a need arises, I'm always happy to step in and help, but I don't have particularly high political what was the word you used? Aspirations. I don't have
Okay.
particularly high political aspirations for
Hmm.
myself in that way. I
Gotcha.
often like to support people who I think are good people running for office. Um, but I've also learned that a lot of good people who may consider run for office, a lot of good people who may consider running for office often think like I do.
Hmm.
So what I have sort of told myself is that if I win this election, I will serve for at least 2 terms,
Hmm.
um, and we'll see from there.
Okay. Okay. I think that's pretty fair. Give your see how it is and see if it suits you and what you can accomplish in that role. But out of every political issue, which are you most passionate about?
Well, so for me, because I'm running for a local office for my state of Alabama, the issues or the crises that we're currently facing are we're having healthcare issues, education issues, criminal justice issues, and economic issues. So, Alabama is one of the 11 states in the US that has not taken the Medicaid expansion. Alabama, as you may know, is a relatively rural state, and so rural healthcare is like a big issue and concern for me. People shouldn't be, waiting 2 hours to get an ambulance to take them to the hospital. Um, and because we did not accept the Medicaid expansion 10 years ago, the quality of healthcare in Alabama is much lower than in a lot of other states. And one of the things that sort of highlights that issue is not only the maternal mortality rate and infant mortality rate in Alabama, but specifically the Black maternal mortality rate, because in Alabama it is the highest in the nation. So the Medicaid expansion, accepting that because the window will close in April of 2023, that is one of my top priorities.
Hmm.
And if
Very
you want to,
understandable.
yeah, if you want to hear about the other priorities, we can get into them, but that's number one.
And I mean, it's very serious. It needs to be something needs to be done about that, like yesterday. So I definitely agree. I definitely agree with you on that being probably one of the more important issues. Uh, Also, I feel as though when people who are not from the South, they tend to have a very negative perception of the South. Um, do you what do you feel like the general public isn't understanding about people from Alabama? Like, is it truly just like backwards hillbillies? Like, what are we not getting? Because I feel like when people kind of throw these generalizations like at the South, and I'm guilty of this because I grew up in San Francisco, but I live in Georgia now. So I had the same perception, but having moved here, it isn't really like that. So what do you think the general public isn't understanding about Alabama?
Um, I think that the reputation that sort of like folks who don't live in the South may hold in some ways. is well earned by the people who are like the loudest, right?
Hmm.
Things that I often sort of bring up is that there really isn't like a state that is totally and completely rural. And if there is, most of those states are actually in the Midwest.
Hmm.
Um, the South has the largest population of like Black folks in the US, as well as queer folks in the US. And so what ends up happening is that in a lot of these states, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Louisiana, their rights, their voting rights in particular, are often like disenfranchised. And so you end up with leaders who, paint this sort of like good old boy image of the South. But the South is actually quite diverse, it's very hospitable. The economies here work for the most part. I think that, you know, when you when you come to the South or when you visit the South, or if you've never been to the South, that a lot of people would be, I guess, surprised. Now, I'm from Huntsville, which is a major sort of like missile defense city. Uh, we built the rockets for the Apollo 11 missions. We are building the rockets for the Artemis mission. Um, and so Huntsville is relatively cosmopolitan in a lot of ways, but the image of like the South that I guess people see, particularly from old media, right? Because it's not really super represented in a lot of media today. But if you're watching like Andy Griffith or things like that, or just listening to people say, "Don't go down south," if you are not a straight white person, you will be immediately like oppressed and violently oppressed. Some of that happens, as we saw with like Ahmaud Arbery, but for the most part, we just be out here minding our business.
Right.
People
Right.
talk about the South like Americans talk about the continent of Africa. Like
Yes.
that's
That's
like
such
if
a
you're
that's a
not
perfect analogy. That is the perfect analogy.
if you're not from here, I don't know, like because I'm have like an insider perspective. Like, yeah, we hunt and fish and farm and stuff, but in every state, people do those things. You know what I'm saying?
Exactly.
And so
Exactly.
then I don't know what the creator is, where people will ask her like inane questions about what it's like living in Africa. She might be in Nigeria, I'm not sure. But you know the creator I'm talking about, they'll ask her like a dumb question about the continent of Africa, and she'll be like, well, where do you get your clean water? And where's your electricity? How do you have internet? It's like, bro, we got the same stuff y'all got.
Exactly. I don't know the creator you're talking about. I think I've probably seen a video. Did she respond to somebody asking like if they speak English or something like that?
Probably. If I can find their page, I'll definitely like send them your way, send the content your way. But yeah, the perception, and again, I lived in New York for 4 years. So when I was in New York, people would always come up to me, um, well, white people would always come up to me and be like in hushed whispers, sort of like, "Oh, we're so glad you got out of the South, and it must have been so hard," and yada yada yada. And I was like, listen, some of the stuff that I've experienced in the South, like I've never felt sort of like segregation and racism as keenly as when I was in New York City for the span of time I was.
Mm,
Um, when I was in New York City, like, the boroughs are very sort of like gentrified,
mm-hmm,
and people have specific parts of town that, if you are a black person, or if you are not sort of like New York elite, sort of like not to go. And
mm-hmm,
so I think that that was very sort of like animated and exaggerated while I was there, in part because New York is such a cultural and then financial capital
mm-hmm.
that um, that it's just easy to feel. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's always interesting because there is also the superiority complex geographically that I think white people have towards each other, where you have like the New Yorkers or people like from the West Coast who just feel as though they are better than like the white people in Alabama or Louisiana. So anytime like having these conversations with people that I go to school with, they're like, "Oh my gosh, like I would be so scared to live in Georgia." I'm like, it's fine. Like, I'm okay. If anything, I deal with way more microaggressions here, at least in Georgia. I know who's overtly racist because they have the Confederate flag on their car. Like, they don't mind letting you know like what they actually think of you as opposed to being on the West Coast or in New England and having no idea, but discovering it through some sort of like subtle comment.
Yeah, it's a lot more insidious. And like I said, when I was in New York, I would it isn't that like I was particularly microaggressed or anything. Actually, my photo ended up on like the Wall Street Journal. I was like the one black dude at this event. Um, I used to mingle with a very interesting crowd when I was in New York, but you certainly feel it, maybe not when they talk about you, right? Maybe if
Mhm,
you are considered a part of like the talented 10th, the folks was
mhm,
not going to speak to W.B. Du Bois and Frederick Douglass the same way they're going to talk about, the nameless other enslaved or formerly enslaved people.
mhm,
And so you definitely feel that. And there are continued conversations about I would rather have like blatant racism and know who feels what way so I can like avoid it or do whatever I got to do than like some of the more insidious subtle things that happen.
mhm, for sure.
So
So
yeah, so that is definitely like an ongoing conversation.
definitely. So for the next question, as far as the political landscape in Alabama is concerned, what are the improvements that need to be made?
So we definitely need to take the Medicaid expansion. So I don't know if you're familiar with like the criminal justice issues in Alabama right now. We have the most violent prisons in the United States.
Mm,
Our governor is like, our governor allocated COVID spending to build like a bigger, newer prison. Now, the legislature did approve the plan because there it was a provision in sort of like the COVID relief bill where basically if states lost income, they could use it for different projects. But not only are the prisons incredibly violent, there was a protest last weekend or the weekend before about the conditions of our prisons. But our prisons are also understaffed. And so, if ever there was a time to sort of like tackle the issue of mass incarceration and the ills that it has led to over time, like Alabama is a great place to start because our criminal justice system is so punitive that there is no hope, really, often of like rehabilitation and voter restoration. So, like I said, we need to expand Medicaid. We need to we need to fix our criminal justice system. If we can get like releases and expungements for non-violent sort of crimes like having cannabis on you, we should definitely do that. um, we need to pay our educators more. We have a national teaching shortage, but again, if things are bad in the US, it's going to be worse in a lot of these poorer states or
mhm,
what are considered to be poorer states. So our teacher shortage is astounding. And then with our current economy, we need to find new revenue streams. Alabama is one of the few states that has like a state sales tax on essentials like groceries and things like that. So we
mhm,
need to get rid of that. We've already approved medical cannabis use and research. We really should just go full legalization, and obviously it should be like taxed and regulated. But there are so many. Well, those are like the top four that I feel like not only in Alabama but nationally, these are things that we could just do that would improve people's lives in the state of democracy in our nation. Also, voter rights. Voter rights is a huge issue, sort of everywhere ever since the Supreme Court, when it was Shelby v. Holder. If you're familiar with that case, the Shelby in question is Shelby County, Alabama. When the Supreme Court gutted that voting rights legislation, we need to pass new voting rights measures because the my state right now, our Secretary of State John Merrill is like in DC. There's a case before the Supreme Court because Alabama has a 25% black population, but there's only sort of like one majority minority district,
Mm,
which is a provision of the Voting Rights Act, where it's like, well, hey, if a state is actively suppressing the vote, then you need to create a district that will adequately reflect the needs and concerns and the voting power of non-white residents. And so the Voting Rights Act, when people talk about um, John Roberts, Chief Justice John Roberts, and his antipathy towards the Voting Rights Act and things of that nature. Um, from a legal perspective, I can understand where he is coming from in that if I'm being generous, it's easy to say that like that law was not equally applied because it was only about basically states that had been involved in segregation and Jim Crow. And if you look at the 14th Amendment, that state, that law, it is for the nation. But as Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson discussed in her arguments in the case, um, it was built in a race conscious way.
mhm,
Voter suppression, gerrymandering, race based voter suppression, or identity based voter suppression can happen in any state. The Constitution, the United States Constitution, grants the right to oversee elections to the states. So the states have broad powers to disqualify people from voting, what have you. And they have, I mean, as soon as Shelby v. Holder was decided, they executed it with a speed that for those, with any historical understanding and context, were like, we told y'all this was going to happen.
mhm.
So with the new Voting Rights Act, so that needs to be passed nationally. And in the interim, I'm going to work on shoring up voting rights legislation in my state right now.
So, in general, why do you think people are so disillusioned with American politics? And how can we get people to feel some level of like personal investment in what's going on?
I don't think that people are disillusioned with American
Okay.
politics. I really don't.
Mhm,
Um, I think that people are paying attention at a rate that we haven't seen before in a long time. I
mm,
mean, the last election had the most voter turnout. I don't know if it was the most in American history or like the second most. What I do know is that in 2008, President Obama was elected. That was like the second or third most voter turnout that we had seen. In 2020, we saw even more voter turnout than when President Obama was elected. So, I mean, there are demographic shifts. Younger people are more involved. Now, this is a message to young voters. Young voters tend to be the least frequent and least reliable voters.
mhm,
So if you all want to see these changes that we all are sort of like discussing, um, there is an election every 2 years. We think
mhm,
about it in 4 year terms because of the presidency, but we reelect Congress every 2 years. Not to mention there may be special elections in whatever state you're in. But I think that attention to our politicians is beginning to rise again, and I hope that we maintain these levels. We
mhm,
may be disillusioned with the sort of crookedness and the callousness that we see, particularly at the national level, right? Your Marjorie Taylor Greens, your Lauren Boeberts, and so on and so forth, your Ted Cruzes. But I don't think that any sensible person can look at the Trump administration, can look at the Bush administration, the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and then the current Biden administration, and say that the Republican presidents and administrations like did exceptionally well for the nation.
Mm-hmm.
When in the Bush administration, there were two recessions. You had the one in '01, and then you had the Great Recession. And then, President Obama and his administration sort of worked to move us out of that. And then we had the Trump tax cuts, which exploded the deficit and also income and wealth inequality. And then you have the Biden administration that has to like go back and fix that.
Mm-hmm.
There has not been a popularly elected Republican president since Ronald Reagan.
Mm-hmm.
No Republican president since Ronald Reagan has won the popular vote. There's an asterisk by Bush in his second election because there's definitely an asterisk in the first one.
Mm-hmm.
So we may be tired of like seeing these people, but if we're tired of seeing these people, vote them out.
Right. Right. Is that simple? Um, I was gonna ask another question, but it just okay. Do you feel like people, especially young voters, from your observations, are impatient with change? Like I recall, I'm guilty of this 1000%, but like when Biden was elected, immediately people were like, well, he's not doing this, and like, where's he promised us like this, like, why isn't it happening? Do you think that we're not really allowing politicians that we elect to kind of go through the process that it takes to get the legislation that we ask for?
No, because there were things that there were things that President Biden could have done. The first 100 days is typically when a president is most effective.
Mhm.
I think that from a strategy standpoint, there were a few executive orders, right, that he could have gone ahead and done. He's done the one on releasing federal prisoners for, again, small cannabis charges and things like that.
Mhm.
He has gotten whatever percentage, the 10,000 or 20,000 student loan debt forgiveness thing done. And granted, right, he wanted to have these things reviewed and yada, yada, yada. But members of his own party, Chuck Schumer, uh, Liz Warren, Bernie Sanders, they all have access to the same resources. They're like, nah, dog, you just sign the executive order right now and wipe
Mhm.
out however much student loan debt you want. You can sign
Yeah.
this executive order now and get these people out of prison. What I will say is this: you, I, I don't think necessarily that you can be sort of like too impatient for change. I do think that you have to put your money where your mouth is, and if you want to see change, then you have to be actively pursuing it. But
Mhm.
to me, one of the greatest sort of features of a functioning democracy is the accessibility of your politicians, the constituents' ability to be like, hey, you're not moving fast enough. The ability to criticize your elected officials is key to the heart and soul of democracy.
Mhm.
So when people are always like young people don't understand how the system works, I'm like, a lot of us do. A lot of us
Mhm.
do. But it's a large system. The American government is a large system. It does not always move with rapidity, but it can. And as long as we keep banging on our chest, we are going to bang on our chest and voting. We are going to get the things that we are fighting for.
Mhm.
Also, caveat: I know I speak long and we're running out of time, but um, when the Roe decision leaked, and then when it was finally overturned, the first thing that like left leaning politicians did was send out donor emails. So you can say that a
Mhm.
lot of this stuff, the timing of a lot of this stuff is happening like right before the midterms,
Mhm.
which basically means like, all right, we're gonna, I don't want to say drag our heels, but these are gonna be like our political chips that we'll play to try to make sure that we get the Senate majority we need. When really, if you were looking at like the Republican playbook, you just like bang out these policies and
Mhm.
make sure that you're feeding and engaging your base. And
Mhm.
that's how you consistently win elections. So that's
Mhm.
my take on it. But I'm never gonna like point down to young folks and be like, y'all are asking for too much too fast. Like it's not. I think that's mythical.
Hmm. That's very fair. That's very fair. I think these are definitely conversations that I've had with like my mom where I'm like, I mean, he could do a lot more than what he's doing. Like, why is he letting what was that guy's name from West Virginia, Joe Manchin or whatever his name is? Like, why is he letting those people giving them so much leverage? Like, just put them on, use your bully pulpit, put them on the chopping block. And get us what we want type thing. But I do see what you're saying in terms of the Democrats maybe playing a little bit of poker, but also like there's lives at stake, so maybe don't.
Yeah.
um,
Well, I'll say of the Mansion cinema thing, is that so the filibuster that we currently have in place is a Senate rule, which means that the Ways and Means Committee basically put it in place. It's nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. You don't need 60 votes to pass a bill. But given that that is the way that we're currently operating, um, Manchin had his leverage basically until the time expired. So Manchin does not have that much leverage. He and Cinema are for election in 24. So their constituents will have the opportunity to potentially vote them out. um, but if we're just talking about sort of the things that President Biden could have got accomplished by executive order, we're seeing, like I said, the student debt relief
mhm.
and freeing folks from prison, federal prison, for cannabis related charges. Like, yeah, he could have done that 2 years ago.
Mhm. Well, we have less than a minute left, so I'm gonna do our little an outro. But thank you so much, Korey, for joining me this evening and learning a little bit more about you and about the changes that you want to make in Alabama. And I hope people watch this who haven't registered to vote. Please do. And if you're in Alabama, I know a couple people in Alabama who are, and you're in District 7, you know who to vote for.
Absolutely.
But yes, any last
Sydney, thank
words?
you. Vote, baby, vote. And thank you
Mhm.
for having me.
Of course. Peace.